The Americans in the west, however, were having an easier time. The fighting around Caen had sucked in the majority of the German defenders. As the American forces prepared to thrust further into France, they faced only scattered opposition. The scene was set for the Allied forces to break out at last. At 9:30 in the morning of July the 25th, 1944, over 1,800 Allied aircraft carpet-bombed a 4-mile stretch of the German front line south of Cherbourg. It was the beginning of Operation Cobra, the US breakout into France. The German defenders were stunned by the size of the assault. But so too were some of the US soldiers. The plan had been for the bombers to fly in from the east, parallel to the US front line, to minimize the risk of bombing American troops. But most of the aircraft came in over the top of the US lines. Bombs fell short. Over 100 US troops were hit and killed. Yet despite the ferocity of the bombardment, when the US forces later picked themselves up and moved forward, they found to their astonishment substantial numbers of German troops had survived. The survivors mounted a stubborn resistance. As fighting raged, it looked as though the Americans would fail to break through the German lines. But then, the German defenses crumbled. The next morning, US tanks broke through and moved forward into open country. There was now almost no German resistance left, and the Americans quickly pushed deeper into France. The hill town of Coutances fell. Then the crossroads town of Avranches. As the Allies pressed forward, they were helped by change and confusion in the German High Command. At the beginning of July, 3 weeks after the D-Day landings, Hitler dismissed the German commander-in-chief, Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt, for defeatism. Von Rundstedt had made little attempt to hide his belief that Germany faced an unwinnable struggle. He was replaced by Field Marshal Gunther von Kluge, fresh from the Eastern Front, but with little knowledge of northwestern France. Two weeks later, Rommel, the second most senior German officer on the front, was severely injured when his staff car was strafed by a British fighter. Then, with the Nazi command already in confusion, there was an assassination attempt on Hitler's life. On July the 20th, 1944, a disillusioned aristocratic war hero, Colonel Klaus Schenk Graf von Stauffenberg, planted a bomb in the planning hut at Hitler's headquarters in East Prussia. Four officers were killed. But Hitler was sheltered by a heavy, solid oak conference table and escaped with only minor injuries. The plot was swiftly and brutally put down. Von Stauffenberg was shot, and his principal collaborators put on trial. They would later be hanged. Hitler put a brave face on it and visited some of the wounded in hospital. But it hardened still further his distrust of his senior officers. He would, despite his many earlier misjudgments, demand even greater control over events on the battlefield. Back in France, General George Patton, back in charge of a real fighting force, ordered his troops to fan out. They took Rennes, Mayenne, and headed for Le Mans. They were now moving round behind the German forces, still battling it out with the British and Canadians near Caen. With the Americans to their south and the British to their north, it seemed the German forces in Normandy would be surrounded. Hitler issued his usual order that there should be no retreat, but as the Allies squeezed in on them, the Germans began to flee. They were remorselessly harried by Allied aircraft and artillery. The casualties were appalling. Finally, on August the 20th, 1944, the Allied forces moving in from both the north and south met up. The so-called Falaise Gap, named after the nearby French village, had been closed. Large numbers of Germans were trapped. Over 10,000 more Germans, caught in the Allied pincer, died. A further 50,000 were taken prisoner. The German army in Western Europe was in chaos. Meanwhile, far to the south, on the French Mediterranean coast near Cannes, there was a second Allied seaborne invasion. US troops came ashore virtually unopposed. They were helped by paratroopers from the Free French Army, men who had escaped from German-occupied French territory in Europe and North Africa. The landing had always been opposed by the British, who regarded it as a diversion. But the United States had long regarded it as an essential part of clearing the Germans out of France. The troops were greeted by an ecstatic civilian population. It was soon advancing rapidly up the Rhone Valley. Lyon was liberated on September the 3rd, 1944. Ten days later, they reached Dijon and made contact with Patton's forces advancing from western France. German units stationed across the region fled. In barely 3 weeks of headlong advance, the Allied invasion of Europe had liberated most of France. That left Paris, where French resistance fighters now rose up against the German occupation. There seemed little to prevent the Allied onrush from continuing to the German border.